I never liked Blackwater Lake. Even as a child, I felt uneasy near it. The water was too dark, too still, as if it were watching. And when the fog rolled in, swallowing the shoreline, it felt like something was hiding beneath the surface, waiting. This morning, the mist was thicker than usual, curling around the trees like grasping fingers. The air smelled of damp earth and something else, something rotten. I pulled my coat tighter around me and stepped closer to the dock, where a cluster of people stood in eerie silence. Then I saw it. A body floated just beyond the wooden planks, face up, eyes wide open. The lake had bloated the skin, turning it pale and waxy, but the expression on the dead man's face was unmistakable. Terror. Sheriff Malcolm Hensley stood at the edge of the dock, chewing on the end of an unlit cigarette. He didn't look surprised. None of them did. Another one. Someone muttered behind me. Another one. I turned sharply. What do you mean, another one? The man, a grizzled fisherman whose name I didn't know, shrugged, eyes fixed on the water. Happens every year. A cold weight settled in my chest. The sheriff sighed and waved to his deputy. Pull him in. Let's get this over with. Two men in uniform grabbed a long pole with a hooked end and nudged the body toward the shore. The movement sent ripples through the lake, but beneath the water, there was nothing. No rocks, no weeds, just blackness. I forced myself to look at the corpse. The man's clothes were soaked, but not torn. His hands were clenched in a fist, fingernails caked with something dark. Mud, maybe. His lips were slightly parted, as if he had tried to scream before the water swallowed him. I took a slow breath. Who is he? The sheriff didn't even glance at me. Don't know. I frowned. You don't recognize him? Nope. Is he from out of town? Probably. Then how did he end up in Blackwater Lake? At that, the sheriff finally looked at me, his gaze unreadable. That's the real question, isn't it? The men hauled the body onto the shore and covered it with a thin sheet. The fog had begun to lift, revealing more of the lake, but it didn't make me feel any better. In fact, it made things worse, because for the first time in my life, I thought I saw something moving beneath the surface, a shadow just below the waves. And when I blinked, it was gone. The town of Blackwater has a way of swallowing secrets whole. I walked through its narrow streets that afternoon, the damp air clinging to my skin like a warning. The smell of wet earth and lake water never really left this place, no matter the season. The houses, with their peeling paint and slumped porches, stood like silent witnesses to something no one wanted to talk about. At the diner, the bell over the door gave a tired jingle as I stepped inside. A handful of people sat hunched over their coffee, their voices low. The place felt warm but heavy, like the air itself carried the weight of unsaid things. Behind the counter, Linda Calloway poured coffee into a chipped white mug. She was in her late 50s, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, the kind of woman who had probably seen everything this town had to offer. Evelyn, she greeted, her voice cautious. You're back earlier than usual. I slid onto a stool. Yeah, something happened this morning. She didn't ask what. She just wiped the counter with slow, deliberate strokes, her gaze flickering toward the other customers. A few of them shifted in their seats, pretending not to listen. I leaned in. Another body. Her hand froze for half a second before she continued wiping. That's so. You already knew, didn't you? I pressed. Linda let out a small breath through her nose. It's the lake, she said simply, as if that explained everything. And maybe, in her mind, it did. I studied her face, looking for any crack in her composure. Don't you think it's strange? I asked. The way they always turn up around this time of year? Always the same way. Bloated, faces twisted in terror, like they saw something before they drowned. Her lips thinned. She placed the rag down and looked me in the eye. I think you should leave it alone. A chair scraped against the floor as someone stood up behind me. I turned to see Harold Bishop, one of the town's oldest residents, shuffling toward the door. His coat was too big for his frail frame, and his cloudy eyes held something that looked almost like guilt. They always come back, he muttered, more to himself than to me. And so do the questions. The bell jingled again as he pushed the door open and disappeared into the mist outside. I turned back to Linda. What did he mean by that? She sighed, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Harold's been here longer than most. He remembers things people don't talk about anymore. Like what? She took a sip before answering. Like the first body that ever washed up. Happened before I was born, but folks say it was a boy. A stranger. No one knew him, and no one claimed him. The sheriff buried him in the cemetery out by the woods, and that was the end of it. But it wasn't the end, I said. She shook her head. No. Every year, another body. Sometimes a man, sometimes a woman. Never the same face, never anyone from town, and never any answers. A chill crawled up my spine. So what does the sheriff say? Linda gave a hollow laugh. Same thing he's always said. Accidental drowning. That's it. I asked, my frustration creeping in. She placed her mug down gently, her expression unreadable. That's it. I glanced around the diner again. The other patrons were keeping their heads down, eyes fixed on their plates or their coffee. Not one of them would look at me. The silence in the room stretched, pressing against my skin like a weight. Blackwater wasn't just a town that had forgotten. It was a town that chose to forget. The office smelled of old books, antiseptic, and something faintly metallic like rust or dried blood. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination playing tricks on me, but the air itself felt heavy, thick with the weight of unspoken things. Dr. Arthur Pembroke sat behind a massive oak desk, his hands neatly folded, his eyes unreadable behind a pair of thin-rimmed glasses. He was older than I expected, late 50s, maybe early 60s, with silver-streaked hair combed back, so precisely it almost looked unnatural. His face was sharp, angular, and though his expression was calm, there was something unnerving about his stillness, as if he were listening for something I couldn't hear. "You're Evelyn Marsh," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. I nodded, taking a seat in the chair across from him. It creaked under my weight, its wood dry and cracking like old bones. "I wanted to ask you about the bodies that keep surfacing in Blackwater Lake." His expression didn't change. No flicker of surprise, no crease of concern. He simply tilted his head slightly, as if considering how much patience he wanted to grant me. "You're not the first to ask about them," he said. That caught my attention. "And what happened to the others?" He exhaled softly, something like a sigh but too controlled, too measured. "Most of them let it go. They learned that some questions don't need answers." I leaned forward. "And the ones who didn't?" His gaze didn't waver. "They left." A chill ran down my spine. I glanced around his office, at the towering shelves lined with books, some medical, some old enough to belong in a museum. A large framed certificate from Harvard hung behind him, its glass reflecting the dim glow of the desk lamp. Everything about this place was curated, controlled, just like the man sitting in front of me. "Doctor," I said, keeping my voice even, "you've examined many of the bodies, haven't you?" He hesitated for just a fraction of a second. If I hadn't been watching him so closely, I might have missed it. "I have." And his fingers tapped against the desk, slow and deliberate. "And they drowned. That's all. That's all." I shook my head. "No. The marks on them, the condition of their bodies. It's not natural. You must have seen it." For the first time, something in his expression shifted. It wasn't fear, but it was close. A shadow of unease flickered across his face before he smothered it with a practiced calm. "I think you're searching for something that isn't there, Miss Marsh." I ignored the dismissal. What if I told you I found records going back decades? Reports of bodies washing up, just like this, year after year. And not one of them ever belonged to a missing person from town. Doesn't that strike you as odd? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for a silver pen on his desk, rolling it between his fingers like a man contemplating his next move. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, but heavier. "You're not from Blackwater, are you?" I hesitated, but only for a second. "No." He nodded, as if that confirmed something for him. "Then you don't understand this town." "I'm trying to." His lips pressed into a thin line. "Miss Marsh, some histories are too dangerous to resurrect." I leaned closer. "What are you afraid of?" His gaze darkened. "Not everything should be uncovered." The room felt colder. The silence between us stretched, tense and suffocating. He was trying to warn me off, to scare me into dropping this. But fear was the one thing that had never stopped me before. I stood up, leveling my eyes with his. "I'm going to find out the truth, Doctor, whether you help me or not." He didn't move, didn't blink. Then, slowly, he set his pen down and folded his hands again. When he spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. "Be careful what you look for, Miss Marsh. The lake does not like secrets being disturbed." I left his office with my heart pounding, my mind racing. The way he spoke, it wasn't just a warning. It was something more, something closer to a threat. The library in Blackwater smelled of dust and old paper, the scent of forgotten things. The shelves were crammed with records, town history books, and yellowed newspapers, their edges curling like dead leaves. I settled into a wooden chair near the window, where the gray light of an overcast afternoon barely reached. I had spent the past few hours searching for any mention of the lake and the bodies that surfaced every year. The sheriff refused to keep official records beyond unexplained drownings, but I knew the truth had to be buried somewhere. My fingers traced along the brittle pages of an old newspaper, dated October 17th, 1946. The headline sent a chill through me. Local man found dead in Blackwater Lake. Authorities baffled. The article was short, like all the others I'd seen. No details, no follow-up. But then, something caught my eye. Markings on the victim's body remain unexplained. Officials declined to comment. Markings. I flipped through the papers, searching frantically. Another case, dated 1953. Strange symbols found on body recovered from Blackwater Lake. Police dismiss ritualistic theories. Another, in 1961. Mystery deepens as lake continues to claim victims. It wasn't just that the bodies appeared every year. It was that they were all marked. My heart pounded as I pulled out my notebook and scribbled the dates down. The pattern was clear. Every autumn, without fail, a body surfaced. And every single one bore strange, unexplained markings. I leaned back, rubbing my temples. What did it mean? Some kind of ritual? A warning? And why did the town keep pretending it wasn't happening? I needed more. Leaving the library, I decided to visit the only person who had ever seen these bodies up close, Dr. Pembroke. His office was tucked away on a quiet street, a small white building with a rusting sign that read Pembroke Family Practice. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside. The waiting room was empty, the walls lined with fading portraits of men who had clearly been part of the Pembroke lineage. Each one stared out with the same cold, knowing expression. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes, barely looked up. Dr. Pembroke is with a patient. I'll wait. Minutes dragged by, and I tapped my fingers against the armrest of my chair. Finally, the door to his office creaked open, and Dr. Pembroke stepped out, smoothing the sleeves of his coat. His gaze landed on me, and for the briefest moment, something flickered across his face. I stood. We need to talk. His jaw tightened. Miss Marsh, I told you before, bodies don't just appear out of nowhere. I cut in. And they sure as hell don't mark themselves. Silence. His lips pressed into a thin line, but instead of arguing, he stepped aside and gestured for me to enter his office. The room was dimly lit, the heavy scent of antiseptic filling the air. Shelves lined the walls, filled with thick medical books and glass jars filled with things I didn't want to identify. I sat across from him as he folded his hands neatly on the desk. What do you want to know? I hesitated, then laid my notebook on the desk, pointing to the list of dates. Every year, every autumn, a body appears in Blackwater Lake, and every single one has something on them. He didn't look surprised. He didn't even flinch. I leaned forward. You've seen them. What are they? A long pause. Then, in a voice so quiet I barely heard it, he said, scars. The words sent a shiver up my spine. I swallowed hard. What kind of scars? Dr. Pembroke's fingers tightened around the edge of his desk. His eyes flicked toward the window, as if someone might be listening. Then he sighed. They're not injuries, he murmured. Not for knives or burns. They look intentional. Carved. Like symbols. My blood ran cold. Symbols. I whispered. He nodded, his expression unreadable. Patterns. Repeated across different bodies. And not just in recent years. For as long as my family has been in this town, a heavy silence settled between us. I felt a sickening weight in my stomach. The Pembroke family had been doctors here for generations. That meant he wasn't just speaking as a physician. He was speaking as someone who had inherited the town's secrets. I forced myself to ask, what do they mean? His gaze met mine, steady and dark. I don't know, he said, but something in his voice told me he was lying. The wind howled through my bedroom window, rattling the glass like impatient fingers tapping for attention. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the uneasy quiet of Blackwater at night. The town always felt different after sunset, too still, too expectant, as if something was waiting just beyond the darkness. I hadn't been able to shake the feeling since finding that body in the lake. There was something unnatural about the way it had surfaced, something that made my stomach twist whenever I thought about it. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. The clock on my nightstand read 3:12 a.m. when I heard it. A whisper, soft, wet, like a breath carried through water. It came from outside. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to listen. For a few seconds, there was nothing but the wind. Then it came again, low, hushed words curling through the air, too faint to understand but unmistakably real. I moved to the window and peered out. The street below was empty, bathed in the weak glow of the flickering street lamp. But the sound wasn't coming from the street. It was coming from the lake. A deep fog had rolled in over the water, thick and heavy, swallowing the shoreline in ghostly white. The surface of the lake was still, too still. Not a single ripple, not a hint of movement, as if it were holding its breath. Then the whispers came again, rising and falling like a conversation, just out of reach. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around the windowsill. They were coming from beneath the water. I couldn't explain how I knew. I just did. I told myself to turn away, to go back to bed, and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But my body moved on its own. Before I knew it, I was pulling on my coat and stepping out into the cold night air. The town was eerily silent as I walked toward the lake. My footsteps barely made a sound on the damp ground, as if even the earth wanted to keep quiet. The closer I got, the heavier the air felt, thick with moisture, thick with something else I couldn't name. When I reached the shore, I stopped. The fog clung to the water like a living thing, swirling in slow, deliberate patterns. The lake stretched out before me, dark and endless, reflecting nothing but shadows. Then, ever so faintly, I saw movement beneath the surface. A shape. No, several shapes. They drifted just below the water, distorted by the darkness, shifting like figures caught in an unseen current. My breath hitched. The whispers grew louder. They weren't coming from one voice, but many, murmuring, pleading, calling. I took a step back. The water rippled. I froze. Something was rising. A pale hand broke through the surface, fingers splayed, reaching. Then another, and another. My stomach lurched. The whispers became a chorus, a desperate, hungry sound that filled the air, pressing against my skull. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The voices weren't outside me anymore. They were inside. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. The lake churned, the water bubbling like something was about to break free. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was back in my house, slamming the door behind me, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the lock. My ears were ringing, my chest heaving. For a long time, I stood there listening. The whispers had stopped, but I knew they weren't gone. They were waiting. And somehow, I knew they would call for me again. The Blackwater Public Library was colder than the autumn air outside. I rubbed my hands together as I flipped through brittle newspaper clippings, their edges yellowed with time. Dust rose from the pages like ghosts stirred from sleep. The scent of aging paper and ink filled my nose, but beneath it was something else, something stale like rot that had settled deep into the wood of the shelves. I had been there for hours, piecing together a story no one wanted told. The bodies in Blackwater Lake had been surfacing for decades. Not just a few years. Not just the past century. Longer. And always in the same way. Drifting up in the autumn fog. Their mouths open as if they had tried to scream before water filled their lungs. I ran my fingers over a headline from 1943. Blackwater Asylum closes after tragic incident. Beneath it was a grainy black and white photo of a sprawling, Gothic building. I recognized the name immediately. Blackwater Lake Sanatorium. My heart pounded as I read the article. The asylum had been shut down after a series of patient deaths, all labeled accidental drownings. The reports claimed some of the inmates had wandered from the facility and fallen into the lake. But the numbers didn't make sense. Too many victims. Too many accidents. I flipped to another article. A list of the dead. My stomach twisted. Most of them were young. Women. A few men. All diagnosed with conditions that, by today's standards, wouldn't have warranted institutionalization, melancholia, hysteria, nervous disorders. And at the bottom of the page, one name stood out. Dr. Charles Pembroke, lead physician. I exhaled sharply. The name sent a shiver through me. Dr. Arthur Pembroke's grandfather. I sat back, trying to process what I was seeing. The same family that had been treating the town's sick for generations had also been in charge of the asylum. The same family that had a direct link to the bodies appearing in the lake. Coincidence? No, not in Blackwater. I leaned in closer, scanning the fine print. The final days of the asylum had been chaotic. Patients had reportedly become restless, their behavior shifting into what doctors described as episodes of collective hysteria. One woman had carved symbols into the walls of her room, repeating the same phrase over and over. The lake remembers. I swallowed hard. The lake remembers. A sudden thud startled me. I turned sharply, my heart racing, but it was just the old librarian pushing a cart of books down the aisle. She barely spared me a glance. I looked back at the article. There was one last piece. A patient ledger, partially intact. It listed dates, names, conditions, and one chilling detail, treatment methods. Beside some of the names, written in faded ink, was a single word. Cleansed. I knew what that meant before I even let myself think it. Drowned. I clenched my fists. These weren't accidents. These were murders, hidden behind the mask of medicine. I shut the book, pushing it away like it had burned me. The weight of the town's secret pressed down on me, heavier than ever. The lake wasn't just a place where bodies appeared. It was a graveyard, a memory of sins that refused to stay buried. And I had a feeling I wasn't the only one it had been whispering to. I'd known from the moment I walked into Dr. Pembroke's office that he was hiding something. There was an air about him, something in the way he avoided my eyes, the way his hands trembled when he touched the paperwork on his desk. But I hadn't expected him to be this deep into it. I hadn't expected him to look at me like I was the problem. When I arrived at his mansion later that evening, the fog had already crept in. Blackwater's signature blanket, heavy, wet, and thick as sin. I parked my car near the iron gates and walked up the long, overgrown driveway, each step on the gravel crunching like confession. The mansion loomed above me, its broken windows staring out like dead eyes, its brick walls hiding years of forgotten history. The place had always unsettled me. Even as a child, I could feel the weight of it pressing down on my chest, like it was somehow alive, breathing in the dark. I knocked, though I wasn't sure why. The door swung open before I could even pull my hand away. Dr. Pembroke stood there, pale and expressionless, wearing the same cold demeanor he always did, as if he didn't care what I had to say. His suit, neatly pressed, gave him the air of a man who thought he was above it all. "Miss Marsh," he greeted me, though I could feel the tension in the way he said it. "I didn't expect you tonight. I didn't bother with pleasantries. You've been hiding something, Dr. Pembroke. Something to do with the lake, something to do with the bodies." He stepped aside, allowing me to enter, but his eyes were sharp, cutting through me like knives. He was leading me into the dark, whether I realized it or not. "I've already told you everything you need to know," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "There's nothing more to uncover." I didn't buy it. Not for a second. The bodies don't just show up, do they? Not by accident. They're coming from somewhere, and I'm not leaving until I find out where. He gave me a thin smile, a gesture that didn't reach his eyes. "You're digging too deep, Evelyn. Sometimes it's better not to know." I followed him deeper into the mansion, through long corridors that smelled of dust and something older. The floors creaked beneath our feet like they were trying to tell me something. His family's history, Blackwater's history, was embedded in this place, in every cracked floorboard and every peeling wallpaper. It felt like the house itself was trying to hold its breath, waiting for me to understand what I was walking into. We stopped in a small sitting room at the back of the mansion, a room I'd never seen before. The walls were lined with old portraits, faces frozen in time, their eyes following me as I moved. There was a fireplace, its hearth cold and empty, and in the center of the room, an antique desk cluttered with papers and books. But something caught my eye, an old photograph, faded and yellowing, of a large group of people standing by the lake. Dr. Pembroke's family, no doubt. The image seemed innocuous enough at first, but the more I looked, the more something about it felt wrong. The people in the picture looked too serious, too rigid. They were standing near the water, But their eyes, those eyes were too wide, too empty. Who are they? I asked, pointing to the photo. Dr. Pembroke glanced at it, his face tightening. That's my family. From long ago. Long ago. I pressed. How long ago? Decades, he muttered. It's not important. But I knew it was important. The more I stared at that picture, the more it seemed to come alive, the more the bodies in the lake seemed to call out to me. My mind raced. There had to be a connection. Pembroke's family was tied to the asylum, to the disappearances, and now to the lake. But he wouldn't give me the answers I needed. Not here. I set my jaw. Where are you hiding, Dr. Pembroke? Why won't you tell me the truth? For the first time, his expression faltered, just for a split second, but it was enough. His eyes darkened, and he took a step toward me, his voice dropping low. You don't know what you're asking, Evelyn. There are things buried beneath the lake that should never be uncovered. Things that could destroy everything you think you know. I held his gaze, refusing to back down. I don't care about your family's secrets anymore. I don't care about the town's lies. I'm going to find out what's really going on at Blackwater Lake, whether you help me or not. His eyes narrowed, his hands twitching slightly. You're playing with forces you don't understand. If you go any further, there will be no turning back. You won't be the same person when this is over. You can't scare me anymore, I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of fear and defiance. The lake is calling. I know it is. And I'm not afraid to listen. There was a long, tense silence. He studied me, his lips barely moving as if debating whether to say something else. But then, without warning, he stepped back, a quiet resignation settling in. He finally spoke, his words slower, measured. Then you're already lost. I didn't respond. Instead, I turned to leave, but as I reached the door, I heard him mutter just loud enough for me to hear. You have no idea what you're dealing with, Evelyn. No idea. I paused, feeling the weight of his words press against my back. But I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Not now. The pieces were falling into place, and I could feel it in my bones. The lake, the bodies, the mansion, this was the key. And I wasn't going to stop until I uncovered every last piece of the puzzle. I walked out of his mansion into the fog, my heart pounding and my mind racing. The truth was closer than ever. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Dr. Pembroke had just made a final, dangerous move. And I was already too far in to turn back now. The storm had been gathering for hours, thick, rolling clouds blocking out the moon, turning the world around Blackwater into a shadowy blur. I stood at the edge of the lake, my coat soaked through, my hair matted against my face. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of rain, and something else, something foul like rotting leaves. I'd received an anonymous tip earlier that evening, warning me of what was to come. Someone would be sacrificed tonight, cast into the lake, like the others before them. I didn't know who, but I couldn't let it happen again. Not after everything I'd uncovered. I had to stop it. The wind howled as I made my way along the shore, my boots sinking into the damp earth. The trees swayed, their branches creaking in protest, as if the forest itself knew what was about to take place. I felt a chill run down my spine, the kind that had nothing to do with the cold. As I moved closer to the water, I saw him. Dr. Pembroke. He stood in the clearing, his silhouette barely visible against the darkened sky. His hands were raised above his head, holding something, or someone. I squinted, my heart pounding in my chest as I stepped closer. It was a man, unconscious or maybe dead, draped over Pembroke's arms like a lifeless rag doll. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The air felt thick around me, oppressive, like the earth itself was holding its breath. The lake seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, its surface rippling in slow, deliberate waves. What are you doing, Pembroke? I called out, my voice barely rising above the sound of the wind. He didn't respond right away. For a long moment, he simply stood there, looking down at the body in his hands. Then, he slowly turned his head, his eyes locking onto mine. There was no surprise in them, no fear. Only cold, calm acceptance. You shouldn't have come, he said, his voice low, as if it too had been drowned by the storm. I took a step forward. You're making a mistake. You don't have to do this. Whatever it is you think you're protecting, it's not worth this. Pembroke's lips curled into a faint, sorrowful smile. You think I have a choice? This town, this lake, they demand payment. Every year, without fail. And if I don't, he paused, glancing down at the body in his arms, then back at me. If I don't, they come for me. I shook my head. What are you talking about? This isn't a sacrifice. It's murder. His eyes darkened, his grip tightening on the man's body. It's the only way. The lake, it's been watching, waiting. All these years. And if we don't give it what it wants, it takes from us. One way or another. He looked at the lake, as if seeing something I couldn't. I felt it then. The shift in the air. The water, once still, began to move. Gently at first, like a ripple, but then it quickened, churning as if something was rising from the depths. No, I whispered, stepping back. No, you can't. But it was too late. Pembroke stepped forward, the body dangling from his arms like a marionette. He moved toward the water with slow, deliberate steps, his face expressionless. I reached out, my voice cracking as I called to him again, but he didn't turn. As he waded into the lake, the water began to glow. A faint, eerie light pulsed beneath the surface, like something alive was moving just out of sight. The air around me hummed with an energy that made my skin crawl. The lake was alive. It was hungry. I stumbled forward, my heart pounding. Stop, please. But Dr. Pembroke kept moving, his feet sinking deeper into the water, his eyes never leaving the surface. He was beyond hearing me now. His mind was somewhere else, lost in the fevered madness of his own belief. The water rose higher, swirling around him, as if the lake itself were wrapping its cold, clammy fingers around him, pulling him deeper into its depths. Then, the scream. It wasn't the scream of the man he held. It wasn't human at all. It was a guttural, inhuman sound that rose from the lake itself, like the very earth was crying out in agony. The water around Pembroke began to boil, frothing and churning, waves crashing violently against the shore. And then it happened. A figure rose from the depths, a shape formed of shadow and water, its face distorted, its eyes glowing with an unnatural, otherworldly light. The man in Pembroke's arms convulsed, his body jerking as if he was caught in a vice. The figure's hands reached up, long, skeletal fingers wrapped in tendrils of water, and pulled the man from Pembroke's grasp. For a moment, everything went silent. The storm stopped. The lake stopped moving. The air was thick with something ancient and terrifying. Dr. Pembroke stood frozen, staring into the eyes of the creature that had emerged from the depths. And then, with a final, shrill scream, he was dragged under. The figure's hand shot out, grabbing him by the throat, and in an instant, he was gone, swallowed by the dark waters. The lake settled, the ripples dying down as if nothing had happened. The storm, too, seemed to vanish in the blink of an eye, leaving only a thick, oppressive silence in its wake. I stood there, my legs trembling beneath me, staring at the water. It was still again. Calm. Empty. But I knew the truth now. The lake had taken its payment. And Pembroke, he was never going to come back. I stumbled away from the water's edge, my breath ragged, my heart still hammering in my chest. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The lake, the town, the secrets buried beneath it all. None of it could be undone. But I knew one thing for sure. The lake would be waiting. And next year, the bodies would float to the surface again. The storm came without warning. The sky, once clear, darkened like a bruise, and the wind howled as if the earth itself was screaming. I couldn't explain why, but something in the pit of my stomach told me that tonight was the night when everything would unravel. I stood at the edge of Blackwater Lake, the air thick with the scent of rain and the dampness of the earth, the water before me churning restlessly. There was a strange tension in the atmosphere, as though the very lake was holding its breath. My pulse hammered in my throat, each beat reminding me that I was standing at the threshold of something terrible. Through the sheets of rain, I saw him, Dr. Arthur Pembroke. He stood just a few feet from the edge of the water, his coat billowing like a black flag in the wind, his back to me. In front of him lay a man, unconscious or perhaps already dead, his body sprawled on the damp ground. The lake's waves slapped against the shore, as if eager to claim him. I froze, my heart sinking. It wasn't hard to guess what Pembroke had planned. He was going to throw the man into the lake, just as he had done to countless others, hoping to feed the water, to keep its hunger at bay. The sacrifices were not random. They never were. They had always been part of some unholy ritual, and I was finally standing right at the heart of it. "Dr. Pembroke!" I shouted, my voice cutting through the storm. He didn't flinch, didn't even turn. His shoulders were stiff, rigid with something I couldn't quite place. I took a step closer, my boots sinking into the mud with each movement. "Stop this!" I cried again, but my words were swallowed by the crashing waves. He didn't speak. The silence between us was suffocating, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Then, with slow, deliberate movement, Pembroke turned to face me, his eyes dark and hollow, the light from the storm barely catching the glint of fear buried deep within them. "It's too late, Evelyn," he said, his voice barely audible above the storm. "You shouldn't have come." "What?" I demanded, stepping forward, my hands trembling. "Why are you doing this? Why have you kept it all hidden?" His eyes flickered toward the man lying at his feet, then back to me, his expression unreadable. "Because some truths are better left buried. This lake, it has a hunger. It always has. And if I don't feed it, it takes what it wants." I could barely process his words. You're feeding the lake? Sacrificing people?" Dr. Pembroke's face twisted into a cold smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "You think I wanted this? You think I wanted to continue what my father started? But the lake, it demands. It never stops." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The water, what was it really? Not just a lake, not just a body of water. It was something more, something ancient, something that had been waiting, watching, feeding off the sins of this town for generations. The man at Pembroke's feet stirred, his eyes fluttering open, panic creeping across his face as he looked up at the storm, at the raging water. He seemed to know what was about to happen. I took a step back, my legs weakening under the weight of the revelation. It was happening again. "No!" I screamed, rushing forward. But Pembroke was faster. With a single motion, he lifted the man from the ground and dragged him toward the lake's edge. And then, the lake responded. It wasn't a sound, exactly, more like a sudden shift in the air itself. The water surged violently, as if waking from a long slumber, pulling against the shore with a strength I'd never imagined. The fog, thick and oppressive, seemed to roll out from the lake like a blanket, swallowing everything in its path. "Stop!" I shouted again, but my voice was drowned out by the roar of the water, the eerie, guttural sound that filled the air like the groans of something far older than the town itself. And then, there they were. Figures. Dark, shrouded shapes rising from the depths of the lake, their forms indistinct but undeniable. They emerged from the black water like ghosts, faces twisted in agony, bodies disfigured and half-sunk, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The water seemed to move around them, almost as though it were alive, guiding their forms to the surface. Pembroke froze. His face paled, his hands trembling. He looked down at the man in his grip, then back at the water, at the figures that were now creeping toward us with slow, deliberate steps. It was as if the lake was no longer just a body of water. It had become a vessel, a graveyard for the souls it had claimed over the years. The figures in the water were not just spirits. They were the price of every sin, every sacrifice, every life taken to feed the lake's insatiable hunger. As Pembroke took a step back, I saw the terror in his eyes for the first time. He wasn't in control. He never had been. The spirits, no, the souls of the lake turned toward him. They were not angry, not vengeful, but sorrowful, their eyes heavy with the weight of history. One by one, they reached out, fingers grasping at him, pulling him into the cold, dark depths. "Please," he cried out, but it was too late. The lake was done with him. The souls that had been waiting for decades, the ones he had helped bury, the ones he had helped sacrifice, had come for him, and the water pulled him under. I stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to look away as the lake claimed him. The water bubbled, churned, and then, in a final, gurgling sound, the surface stilled, as if the lake had swallowed its last meal. The storm began to subside, the wind calming, the air clearing. The figures in the water began to recede, fading into the murky depths, their forms vanishing as if they had never been there. The fog rolled back, revealing the lake's surface once more, smooth, still, and deceptively calm. I took a step back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. It was over. The cycle was broken. But the lake would never forget. And neither would I. In the silence that followed, all I could think of was that terrible, inevitable truth. Some things, some places, never let go. And some sins are too deep to ever be washed away. The storm had passed, but the town of Blackwater never quite seemed to dry off. It clung to its damp, fog-wreathed existence, as though the mist itself was a second skin, refusing to shed its secrets. The streets were eerily quiet, not a single person stirring, as though the storm had swept away more than just the rain. It had washed away the last remnants of the truth, leaving only silence in its wake. I stood at the edge of the lake, the water rippling gently in the early morning light, reflecting the pale gray sky. The surface looked calm, but I knew better. Beneath it, something darker was always stirring. The bodies, the history, the ghosts, they had never truly left. I had hoped that when the storm cleared, when the terror of the last night finally faded, the town would confront what had happened. I had hoped that I could return, perhaps with some sort of justice, and let the truth seep through the cracks of Blackwater's carefully constructed lie. But now, as the fog began to lift and the town returned to its daily routine, I saw how wrong I had been. The bodies, the lake, the whispers, all of it was already being buried again. The sheriff had made his statement, his face as grim as ever, but his words had been nothing more than a smooth, practiced lie. Dr. Pembroke's tragic accident, he'd called it. That was the official story, and the town had swallowed it whole. I could almost hear their collective sigh of relief, the way they'd shut their doors and turn their backs. The lake, the dead, the darkness, they could go back to pretending they had never existed. I knew this town. I knew how it worked. And in the end, the truth didn't matter. Not here. I tried to talk to the townspeople, try to get someone, anyone, to admit that something had happened, that the curse of Blackwater wasn't some fantastical tale, but a truth they'd hidden for far too long. But no one would meet my eyes. They just smiled politely and nodded, the way people do when they want you to leave them alone, when they want you to stop asking questions. The local diner, where I had often sat with my notebook, was empty when I walked in. The waitress barely glanced at me before turning away. I ordered coffee, but it tasted bitter, like the town itself. It had always been this way. People moved around with their heads down, pretending they didn't know what was really happening. I saw Margaret, the old woman who lived in the house by the church, shuffling down the street. She looked at me briefly and then quickly turned away, hurrying as though she had somewhere important to be. I'd spoken to her about the lake once, about the bodies, and she had told me the same thing every other resident had. Best not to talk about such things. I thought I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, something I couldn't place. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was fear, but she was already gone before I could ask. The town had decided. The past, and everything tied to it, would remain buried. It wasn't just that they refused to face the truth. They feared it. The silence, the forgetting, it was all they knew how to do. And so, they did it. I spent the rest of the day walking around Blackwater, watching how the town moved on. People went about their business as if nothing had changed. The children played in the streets, the vendors sold their goods, and the church bell tolled its usual mournful chime. The lake remained as it always had, dark and silent, a secret that no one dared speak aloud. I could feel the weight of the town's unspoken promise pressing down on me. They had decided. There would be no more questions, no more searching. The bodies would stay buried, and the lake would continue to claim what it had always claimed. As night fell, I stood at the edge of the lake once more, the wind picking up, rustling the dead leaves that lay scattered across the ground. The water shimmered in the dim light, calm and inviting. But I knew better than to trust it. I knew what lay beneath. But as I turned away, I felt a strange sense of resignation. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was something deeper, something that had been growing in me since the moment I arrived in Blackwater. I didn't belong here. I had never belonged here. I was just another visitor, another outsider who would leave when the ghosts of the past refused to let me stay. The truth would remain hidden, buried beneath the surface, for as long as they could keep pretending. And so I left. The town would pretend, and so would I.